Well, welcome back, everyone, for the
What day is today?
second panel of the Democracy and Freedom Between Past and Future. I realize in my opening remarks, I talked about the democracy and freedom part, but I didn't mention why there was the between past and future. Because in many regards, two thinkers in particular influenced the idea of it. One, the German emigre political theorist Hannah Arendt, and also the Martinican thinker Edward Glissant, each of whom in their own ways tried to orient us to think about not only how do we understand our present, but in many regards, and especially the first panel, questions of futurism in their own ways had emerged, but in some sense trying to think about, in speaking of precarious times, in precarious times, or what Arendt, echoing Bertolt Brecht, talked about in terms of dark times. How do we actually have shards of hope, and also not just for means of survival, but for also creation and thriving. And so in many regards, both Hannah Arendt and Edward Glissant and others have tried to invite us to think about what occurred in the past, or what might not have been reconciled or understood properly in the past, and then how does that, in some sense, project not only to our present and the future. And so our panelists and moderator for our second panel session will hopefully guide us not only in terms of the panel topic, but also with this idea of thinking about democracy and freedom between past and future that includes the present. I would just like to reiterate for those who might have just come in that especially in terms of social media for archiving, not merely for the video, but also for archiving, live tweeting, taking pictures, if you could use the hashtag altogether democracy freedom Williams, so just hashtag democracy freedom Williams. It's a way for people who are not only here to revisit, but also those who couldn't join us to be able to participate. And we've already seen some of the kind of tweets and retweets, so if you can continue to do that, that would actually be great. And so I'll turn it over to my colleague in political science, Laura Ephraim, to introduce us to the panel and to the next round of speakers.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil, for introducing me and for all of your work in organizing this incredible event. I mean, I am accustomed to having to travel for hours living here in the Northern Berkshires to be able to participate in a conversation of this importance and caliber, and so I know how many hours many of you had to travel to get here. So thank you very much for making my life easier and more interesting and pleasurable by doing so. So our second panel this morning is entitled Disposability, Fugitivity, Resistance on the Relationship Between Democracy and Freedom. And so I'm delighted to welcome the panelists who will be speaking to this topic. Starting with Angelica Bernal of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She is Associate Professor of Political Science, and her research and teaching focuses on issues of founding and refounding, popular constitutionalism, and indigenous rights and resistance in Latin America. Bernal is the author of Beyond Origins, Rethinking Founding in a Time of Constitutional Democracy. Bringing together a hemispheric and comparative theory approach, her new project centers on indigenous resistance to natural resources extraction in the Americas, and her paper today is entitled Democracy and Pluralism. And then our second panelist is Marisa Fuentes of Rutgers University. She is Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and History there. And Marisa's scholarship combines critical historiography, historical geography, and Black feminist theory to examine gender, sexuality, and slavery in the early modern Atlantic world. She teaches courses in the history and women's and gender studies programs. And she's the author of Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence, and the Archive. And her paper today is called Refuse or Refuse, I'm not sure which, maybe both, Lives, and the Failures of Freedom, the Origins of Black Disposability and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And I'm just realizing I read Angelica's paper title wrong. I was reading from the next session, so just going back to Angelica, she's actually going to be talking about democracy, colonialism, and indigenous resistance. Okay. So then, finally we have, what? Did I? Yeah, I'm not gonna make you anticipate Victor's talk. Apologize for that. And then we have George Schulman of New York University, professor of political science there. He teaches and writes on political thought in Europe and the United States, as well as on Greek and Hebrew, tragic and biblical traditions. He's the author of Radicalism and Reverence, Gerard Winstanley and the English Revolution, and American Prophecy, Race and Redemption in American Political Culture. And hopefully I can get his paper title right. It is Fred Moten's Refusals and Consents, Natality, Commonality, and the Politics of Fugitivity. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. I will give the floor to Angelica.
Thank you so much, Laura, and oops, I think I've gone ahead. And thank you so much, Neil, for this invitation. I am very, very grateful for this and for already hearing the first panel, which is a very hard act to follow. But I am very appreciative of just the discussion and keeping a dialogue going, because for me it's really debates that I have not been familiar with, that all of a sudden I realized there is just so many linkages between the work. And this is why I'm so appreciative of this forum, because of the way in which it is really about interdisciplinarity. And for me that's particularly important because my own work has straddled between political theory, but also the work that I'm presenting today is for my second book that I'm developing that's based on ethnographic work. So part of it would be some contextualization, so going to the past so we understand things, and part of it would be to do some more of the political theory traditional work. So let me begin. Now, according to a report that was issued by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change this past October, the impacts of global warming are going to be more dire and arrive sooner than we've even anticipated. As early as 2040, rising atmospheric temperatures are going to result in global food shortages, increasing wildfires, droughts, coastal flooding, and overall increases in global poverty rates, as well as the displacement of populations. In response to this glooming crisis, this study, as many others have done, have called for accelerating the global response to climate change by eradicating carbon emissions and transforming the world economy in radical ways to reduce and eventually eradicate our dependence on fossil fuels. But as we've seen the last 2 decades, not only is this an urgent issue, but it's also been a politically challenging one. Because in the Americas, both right and left-wing populist movements have created significant political and economic obstacles, from the reduction of environmental protections to, most egregiously, the direct intensification of extractive industries and projects. Now, we're well aware of what Donald Trump has done. March 28, 2017, he ordered the repeal of the Clean Power Act, which is the first attempt by the government to deal directly with climate change, as well as has denounced, as we've seen, the existence of climate change altogether, cut EPA funding, reduce existing environmental protections, as well as vowed to intensify coal production in other industries, which, as a side note, has also been something in following in the Obama administration's policies, which saw the increase in oil production by 88% between 2008 and 2016. Now, in Latin America, left populist movements in countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, which initially appeared to support environmentally friendly policies and ecopolitics, instead ushered a new era of extractivism. Hugo Chavez's Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela remained firmly situated in the rents derived from its petroleum exports. President Rafael Correa followed suit, financing vast social spending projects he argued would bring Ecuador out of poverty during the commodity boom cycle that saw the price of oil skyrocket. Meanwhile, in countries like Ecuador, like Bolivia, which saw the election of the continent's first indigenous leader, the extractive model was not only not abandoned, but moreover further developed as new areas in the country's Amazonian regions were opened up to extractive industries. What then is the democracy in the context of intensified extractivism? Are we witnessing democracy's death under the viscous flows of crude oil and the unbearable high pressure of hydraulic fracking? Now, to help answer these urgent questions, I propose that we turn to one of the most affected populations, indigenous people. In particular, I look to the case of Ecuador, a country that holds some of the world's most lucrative tapped and untapped oil reserves, as well as the site of one of the strongest indigenous movements in the Americas. Since the late 2000s, conflicts between the state and indigenous groups over extractive policies have escalated, and with it, so has state repression. In the time that I have today, I want to engage in the ways in which indigenous groups in Ecuador have resisted, and particularly the radical anti-extractivist philosophy that has emerged through their resistance. While the politics of indigenous resistance in Ecuador illustrate the challenges facing democracies in the face of increased extractivism, I nonetheless argue that indigenous practice and this anti-extractivist philosophy illuminate new possibilities for anti-colonial politics, the building of solidarity, reconfiguring authority, sovereignty, law, and territory to create opening for democracy's post-extractivist resurgence. To begin, I want to begin by just briefly contextualizing Ecuador's politics of natural resource extraction, so you have a sense of where this is taking place. Now, the contemporary era of extractivism in Ecuador begins with the location of oil reserves in the country's Amazonian region, which is the green part highlighted here, by the Texaco Corporation in 1967. Now, the subsequent production of crude oil and its exportation to foreign markets ushered in what became known as the golden age of petroleum that sedimented the dominance of the extractive models as the predominance of government revenues came to depend on it, often at 40% rates, and most of the export earnings, about half, were dependent on petroleum. This golden age, of course, also ushered in a new period of racial capitalism and colonization of indigenous populations. In the Ecuadorian Amazon, resource extraction and production, whether in the hands of private multinational corporations such as Texaco or the hands of state-owned enterprises like Petroecuador, were made possible by new modes of colonization and racial capitalism. For instance, it was supported by state laws that defined the Amazonian regions as tierras baldias, yet another manifestation of the familiar colonial doctrine of terra nullius, that defined indigenous territories as no man's land, thus allowing the state to declare sovereignty over it and seize it. Companies such as Texaco also engaged in the improper disposal of toxic waste, dumping it in unlined pits, resulting in toxic seepage into the soil, drinking water, contaminating rivers, killing food sources, displacing populations, and resulting in well-documented health problems. Now, indigenous populations, extractivism made clear, would disproportionately bear the burden of this so-called growth and wealth. But in the face of all this, extractivism in Ecuador was met with indigenous resistance. Indigenous groups were successful in disrupting the activities of companies such as Argo in the 1990s through blockades, effective mobilizations, marches, and the occupations of the Ministry of Energy and Mines in 1994. The front against extractivism also took on a legal dimension when indigenous and non-indigenous plaintiffs filed the historic case in US courts of Winda versus Texaco in 1993, seeking remediation for damages resulting from oil spills that leaked 16.8 million gallons of crude in an area in the span of 2 decades, or nearly 6 million gallons more than the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska. Now, to be clear, not all indigenous groups in Amazonian or Andean regions have been united in their opposition to natural resource extraction. Indeed, the politics of extractivist resistance has varied from radical extractivism, which promoted all-out resistance to any oil extraction and the ouster of companies from ancestral lands, to what Teorio Francos has called resource nationalism, or the promotion of the nationalization and collective ownership against that of foreign corporations of the means and products of natural resource extraction. Yet what is interesting is that over the past decade, more and more indigenous groups have organized to reject the extractivist model altogether. So why this turn? Why this turn to radical extractivism? Now, it's nothing new and can be certainly traced to Amazonian groups who were the first to face a direct encounter and effects of extractive policies in their lands. But the emergence of radical anti-extractivism as a unifying policy with many indigenous movements in Ecuador, uniting Amazonian and Andean groups, is certainly a consequence of the entry of Correa and his new left in power. Now, part of this pink tide of the new left socialist governments that swept Latin America in the 90s, Correa's government positioned itself squarely as a repudiation of all that neoliberal governments in the past had been. Elite-driven, egalitarian, capitalist, and governed more by the interest of imperialist masters in the global north than its own people. In the manner of Chavez's Bolivarian revolution, Correa called for a citizens' revolution that would return the patria back to its people and create social and economic policies under the banner of a socialism for the 21st century to benefit the many, not the few. It was to refound the state. Now, what this refounding would mean with regards to development policies was not initially clear. In the beginning, Correa's left in power appeared to be on the road to rethinking the state model of development and convened a constituent assembly in 2007 to do so. One of the outcomes of this was the 2008 Constitution, which included a whole new model of development whose organizing principle was the concept of buen vivir, which was adapted from the Quechua concept of suma causai, or loosely translates as the good life. Distinct from the capitalist model, the socialist model of development would be oriented around public programs to improve the lives of Ecuadorians by lifting them out of poverty, enhancing national sovereignty in the management and benefit of natural resources. This constitution also reflected an emergent extractivist philosophy, no doubt the influence of indigenous assembly members who participated in its constructions. Most famously, Ecuador became the first country in the world to recognize nature as a subject and agent of constitutional rights. These early openings for wholesale rethinking of the extractive model by a new left in power were soon closed off by two developments. First was the commodity boom that saw oil prices skyrocket, increasing government revenues. Now, Correa deployed all of this to finance vast spending social programs that included major infrastructure projects, health clinics, and educational buen vivir centers, as well as a cash transfer program of monthly bonuses or bonos to the poor that did reduce poverty in the country. It also skyrocketed his popularity and helped keep him in power for 3 terms, something unprecedented. But second was, not surprising, with oil cycles, its eventual bust. And with it, the country's tumbling into a recession and debt, having financed the majority of these public projects through foreign loans from China in exchange for future oil concessions. The result of these projects was the intensification of extractivism by increasing oil production, expanding extraction as well into large-scale mining of copper, and opening previously untouched lands to further oil exploration. And all of this disproportionately affected indigenous people as the extractive sites were on their lands. What indigenous people also learned early on that was different from previous neoliberal governments was that Correa's government would not permit any amount of dissent. Dissent would be repressed through the militarization of indigenous territory, the killing of dissident leaders, and the production of new racist discourses that defined indigenous people rejecting extractivism as terrorist and as primitive, standing in the way of collective progress against poverty. In this context, it's in this context that contemporary extractivist, anti-extractivist resistance and philosophy took shape. Now, there are multiple and yet fully engaged strands with this philosophy, so I just want to focus on 2 in the time that I have. One concerns the fundamental reconstitution of the central subject of politics, the people, and the second concerns the rearticulation of territory in a way that unsettles sovereignty at its status foundations. The first turns on the notion of Pachamama as the people. The concept Pachamama has long been present in Andean and specifically Quechua culture. Pachamama is often loosely translated as Mother Earth or nature, but really these are just shorthands for something more complex. In the Andean Quechua myth of creation, the universe, existence, time and space, and all entities within it originate within Pachamama. As the Quechua thinker Ariru Makowi explains, Pacha represents time, universe, such that Pachamama means mother of the universe. He also notes that the appellation Mama further accompanies other references such as mountains, like the mountain Cotocachi would be Mama Cotocachi, sacred places like Wakamama, the moon Kiyamama, water Yakumama, earth land Aipamama. Kowi writes that together these reflect a vision of the world that establishes difference with the vision of the Occidental world because implicit with it is the idea that nature and the universe are a living being and moreover are considered mother or father to the Quechua people, generating with them a level of kinship which is mutually complementing and which, when not taken into consideration, puts totality at risk and with it the integral well-being of all. In the past decade, the concept entered the political arena in powerful new ways. The first entry I noted earlier was the 2008 Constitution, thanks to the advocacy of indigenous representatives. Now, One way in which it entered was the preamble that stated that Ecuador celebrates nature, La Pachamama, which are all part of our vital existence, end quote. Two others were Article 10, which, as I mentioned, granted nature its own rights, but also Article 72, which granted it the right to restoration and reparation, independent from the obligations the state has to it. Now, constitutions can oftentimes be no more than paper tigers, having little bite when lacking self-enforcement and serving as tools by which to further entrench and perpetuate colonialism and its violence. And certainly, when viewed from the perspective of the state, this was the case. Indigenous activists decried Correa's use of these terms while simultaneously pursuing intensified extractivism and violence against indigenous community as nothing more than the co-optation for the sake of establishing his legitimacy as a pink-tide leftist. It seemed that this term, like indigenous lands, had become a new colonial tool for the state. In actuality, this was not the case. Indigenous activists redeployed and expanded the terminology to continue to guide resistance across a range of sites, from international courts into the streets to building solidarities with other social movements and in transnational activism. One turning point were the protests relating to the opening of Yasuni National Park for oil extraction. In late 2013, mass protests ignited over Correa's decision to abandon the Yasuni ITT initiative. Yasuni National Park, located in Ecuador's eastern Amazonian basin, is considered one of the world's most biodiverse areas and is currently home to 5 major indigenous populations. Now, according to this plan, this ITT plan, which was devised originally by indigenous groups and environmental groups, existing oil reserves in this zone would be left untouched. In exchange, industrialized countries were to contribute $3.6 billion, or the estimated value of petroleum, to an international fund of the UN's development program to support social and health and educational programs and supplement government revenues that would otherwise have come from oil production. Now, Correa announced this plan would be abandoned and drilling would begin because he, quote, said the world had failed us since only 13.1 million donations had been collected. In reaction to this move, violent protests erupted in late August and September, bringing thousands of indigenous and non-indigenous protesters to the streets of Quito, the state's capital. But something was unique about these protests. Activists were taking to the streets through discourses and protest actions that invoked Yasuni, and with it, Pachamama, or nature, as an entity with political agency and an agent of constitutional rights. Along with invoking the rights of nature, they also invoked something unprecedented. In the words of a ubiquitous protest sign, "Todos somos Yasuni," we are all Yasuni. Yasuni here did not reflect an externality to humans, but rather kinship relations between humans and non-humans now made political. Yasuni's agency and subjecthood, while not dependent on humans, nonetheless was interpolated with human counterparts in this particular moment to enact a new political subject. This political subject, revealed by the todos, or we, was expressing at once unity and dissent, the people. Yet it is an altogether different people, an empty signifier that enables action in the name of a new collectivity that includes Yasuni as part of El Pueblo Unido. We, the people of Ecuador, did not merely encompass the multitudes of indigenous, mestizo, Afro-Ecuadorian, campesino peoples, but also Yasuni and Pachamama. The entry of natural sites such as Yasuni and with it Pachamama as part of the people was deployed by activists in support of a specific set of demands to leave not only Yasuni untouched, but all oil on the ground that reflected this radicalization into a radical anti-extractivist philosophy grounded in a view of natural sites and with it tierra, or land, as in itself a living entity. Conceptualized in this way, it was not a resource, a thing that could be consumed, commodified, or sold. It was also an entity deserving of respeto, respect. Akin to bodily integrity, protesters further argued that extracting petroleum from Yasuni would be akin to a bloodletting, or in the name of another sign, el petróleo fluye, la tierra sangra, the petroleum flows, the earth bleeds. In invoking Pachamama as the subject of constitutional rights and as part of the people, indigenous activists did something not only subversive, but in many cases quite effective. They expanded the scope of what counts as the popular and popular concern, and thus provided some sources for building much needed solidarity and alliances. Now, this was particularly helpful, this articulation, in challenging in legal courts and in courts of public opinion, a central claim of the state that the state sought to support time and time again, which is the so-called subsoil sovereignty that suggests that all that is below the earth is the patrimony of the sovereign state. Now, recent interventions have further exploded the subsoil sovereignty fallacy. One of these is the philosophical and political project of Sacha Kausai. I'm sorry, that was from Yasini. Developed by the Sarayaku Amazonian activists, including the thinker Patricia Walinga. The proposal first emerged with the Sarayaku people's successful filing, at least it emerged publicly and legally, and with their successful filing before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and their successful case to stop extractive actions on their lands in 2012. With this case, the right of nature and the anti-extractivist position entered into public testimony and would become part of a nascent new jurisprudence. Politically, the Sarayakus developed this victory and the national and international platform it gave them to further ground the anti-extractivism philosophy and political proposals to ground it. The Sacha Kausai proposal political project was subsequently presented in various meetings around the world and advanced as a national proposal, most recently in February 2018. Now, it advances the Pachamama critique of subsoil sovereignty by shifting once again the ontological battleground. Against the statist vision that links territory with sovereignty and defines territory and all within it in anthropocentric terms, Sacha Kausai links territory with the sacred in a web of non-human and human relations. According to Gwalinga, the relationship is a close relationship, a relationship of harmonious coexistence. She writes, for us, the Sacha Kausai is the living forest, and with everything this implies, with all its beings, with all its worldview, with all its culture, with which we are intermingled. These beings are extremely important. They provide us with vital energy. They maintain balance and abundance. They maintain the entire cosmos and are interconnected. These beings are essential not just for the Sarayaku, but for the equilibrium of the Amazon. They are all interconnected, and therefore the Sarayaku defends its living space so ardently, end quote. Under this philosophy, territory is instead linked to self-determination of ancestral populations, freedom from contamination, maintenance of health and well-being, the ability to practice and reproduce ancestral knowledge, customs, systems of organization, and food sovereignty. To implement this, Sacha Kausai entails the declaration of indigenous territories as free from extractivism. This declaration is now being adopted by other groups and manifests itself politically in several radical recent actions. The first is a refusal to engage in processes of consultation established by the government. According to the recent mandate of the Amazonian Women Defenders of Bases Confronting Extractivism, at issue is, and I quote, not consent, but that they should respect our right to self-determination. We reject the socialization of consultations of extractive projects because in our spaces of decision-making, we have already resolved no more extractive projects in our territories. Against the state's own declared sovereign right to sell subsoil resources to foreign companies as part of the national patrimony, the same mandate calls for the nullification of all said contracts. The Sacha Kausai project also introduces two environmental concepts. The first concerns the creation of a new international and national conservation category to declare indigenous territories, quote, a zone free from oil and mining. The second is an alternate geographic demarcation of territory called Hatun Kausak Sisa Nyampi. Translated life frontier or the living way of flowers, this symbolic demarcation would, against the state's demarcation of territorial boundaries, outline Sarayaku and other indigenous lands through the cultivation of a living perimeter of flowering trees in areas of deforestation. In their mature manifestation, these spaces are to be colorful blanket, visible from the air, to demarcate the territories of the people in resistance and provide for spaces of environmental regeneration. Accompanying this project is also the decolonization of earlier concepts such as Suma Kausai. This concept, which entered into the 2008 Constitution, as I noted, has been playing a particularly important role in advancing, or played an important role in advancing Korea's technocratic project of resource nationalism, particularly in pushing the country out of poverty and extractivism. But it also was something that they challenged in a variety of ways. So when I asked Patricia Walinga about whether they should retake the Suma Kausai concept or not, given that it's been playing such a big role for the government and their development project, she said, and I quote, they never understood what it meant. They think about its construction, they think it's about the construction of a new school of the millennium, but this is not going to make us happy. Their researchers are trying to find this buen vivir, but they haven't found it. Buen vivir is not about material wealth or poverty. It is sumak kasai kangi. You will be well with others. You will be in harmony with nature. You will have your sacha, your home and nourishment. Puerme vida is when you are feeling well, when you feel a connection with the sky, when you feel nature and the dew of the earth, when you are in community with your community, without cell phones, but without the stresses, and you're happy. Rather than seek its expulsion from the Constitution, indigenous activists have refused the state's co-optation by further developing the concept from the position that the Zapatistas have called the global. The concept in particular is defining notion of territory as sumak aipa, or land without evil, has been accompanying a radical anti-extractivist philosophy at local protest, as well as been taken by indigenous activists organizing transnationally with other environmental activists, giving the concept new spaces and significations beyond the state. Increasingly in recent years, attacks and suppression against indigenous activists have intensified. Indigenous nature defenders continue to face military occupation, detention, and death threats. Many of the most nationally and internationally recognized leaders, many of them who are also women, have received death threats, attacks on their homes, and intimidations up to this year. But in the face of this, I believe their innovative activism has been instrumental in transforming Ecuadorian politics and creating some political openings that would not have been there in the first place. By creating spaces for alliances with popular ecological movements, this activism helped to begin crack Correa's popularity and was instrumental in helping to turn public opinion against him. After 3 terms in office, and despite his attempts to enact constitutional reform to have indefinite terms for himself for the presidency, Correa, in the face of public opinion, stopped his push to run for office for a 4th time. Now, his successor, Lenin Moreno, continues to face anti-extractivist opposition by indigenous activists as he continues the policies of his predecessor. But some things have changed. The president recently put a public referendum that included 2 questions about whether the state should prohibit metallic mining in protected areas and whether the state should increase intangible zones, such as in Yasuni Park. This measure, which was put forth this year in February, was in large part supported by yes votes by a margin of 70%, suggesting large public support for increasing protections of these areas and to prohibit extractivism. So what is a democracy in the context of intensified extractivism? For indigenous activists and their allies in Ecuador, it is a democracy in extinction, but one that can be renewed by a post-extractivist democracy. This post-extractivist democracy is one born from a radical politics of refusal to reject state extractivist projects and, in an uneven economic and political war against the state, to use alternative intellectual projects and knowledge to recast the battlefield and its stakes. It involves new modes of anti-colonial sovereignty that reject the state's engulfment of sovereignty as a capacity for life and death decision on territories through extractive development. In an age of global crisis, life and death exceeds even state power. In light of this, indigenous radical anti-extractivism ultimately suggests the need for a new democratic habitus to reshape understandings of humans' relations to their environments and to catalyze greater collective resistance against state inaction. Thank you.
Good morning. It's still morning. It is. We got a few more minutes. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I want to continue the echo of thanks, Neil, of course, for the invitation to be part of this dynamic and generative conference, and also to Carrie and Veronica for organizing travel and accommodation. I will be honest, I'm not sure why I'm here. In a tongue-in-cheek way, because my work is 6th, 17th, and 18th century history, and I hadn't really considered concepts of democracy. But after the last panel and hearing your paper, I think that the language and some very important concepts will resonate throughout. So I look forward to our discussion as we move forward. I want to say, too, that my work has been about not recovery, but attention to those that are most historically invisible, silenced, and vulnerable. And so the paper I'm going to give, the very brief paper I'm going to give, is thinking through some of these concepts through my last project, but introducing a very new project that I beg your indulgence as I'm sort of working out some key concepts. So let me also start my timer. Okay. In a 2016 special issue of History of the Present, cultural studies scholar Saidiya Hartman asks, quote, "How do we attend to Black death? How is the chronicle of death foretold, expectant, and always looming on a slave ship, dissimilar to the threat of death that hangs over the head of a population that remains the target of the state's militarized violence? The intimacy with death that was first experienced in the slave ship's hold," she concludes, "continues to determine Black existence. Democracy and the now neoliberal economic order were forged with European heels bearing down on the necks of captive and enslaved Africans. As Chris Manjapra argues in his forthcoming article in Social Text, quote, "From the perspective of racial capitalism, the production of incarcerated, dispossessed, and disposable subjects was essential to the rise of political and economic liberalism as the isomorphic replication of rights-bearing citizens within the nation state." And here Hartman concurs. "The afterlife of slavery is defined by the enduring and seemingly interminable clutch of the slave ship's hold on our present, and by the ongoing processes of dispossession, accumulation, and extermination. Ours is not a melancholy relation to the past, but a structural one," end quote. In this short paper, I want to explore the condition of Black disposability, allegedly the antithesis of democracy and freedom, through the brief lives of the so-called refuse slaves of the transatlantic slave trade. I will first quickly revisit the concept of freedom in an 18th century slave society in which a certain kind of Black autonomy relied on enslaving others, and then turn to the fleeting lives and certain deaths of the refuse slaves, the captive Africans who were often deemed unsellable at the end of the Middle Passage and left to die. I want to juxtapose a freed woman of color's life and economic independence with the condition of disposability to argue that the concept of freedom must be untethered from the liberal humanist formulations in order to approximate the conditions and spectrums of enslavement, but also to make sense of the limits of freedom for commodified people. In a chapter of my first book, Dispossessed Lives, I considered how freedom was lived by people of color in 18th century Bridgetown, Barbados, in order to trouble the binary between slavery and freedom, and to complicate the term agency in slavery scholarship. I revisited the life of an infamous brothel owner, Rachel Pringle Polgreen, who amassed a small fortune through the sexual labor of her mostly female slaves. Polgreen was a woman of color, a former slave turned slave owner, and many stories circulated that she ran a well-known brothel without much controversy. Persistent representations of Polgreen's life draw from an archive unusual for women of color in 18th century slave societies. She left a will, and her estate was inventoried by white men upon her death, a process that's usually primarily used for society's wealthier and white citizens. Her relationships with elite white men and the British Royal Navy were well documented in newspaper accounts, and most significantly in a 19th century novel written by a Barbados resident who was likely well acquainted with her. In the 1770s and 1780s, this female capitalist appears in Bridgetown's tax records as a propertied resident, and her advertisements in the local newspaper allude to the importance she placed on her possessions. From a caricatured 1796 lithograph, and I'll pause here if you want to Google this image, it's Googleable, to the folkloric accounts of Prince William Henry of England's rampage through her brothel, Pringle Polgreen appears as a mythical figure in literature, folklore, and in the archive. Yet my work revealed that her agency, another liberal humanist construct, as an economically independent woman of color obscured her violent participation in the slave economy, and the ways in which her autonomy depended upon the negation of freedom to the people she owned. In the context of 18th century Barbados, the abilities that defined Polgreen's economic and social power, to borrow language from Sabah Mahmood, or her modes of agency, were produced by the system of slavery and existing structures of inequality and denigration, and were not harnessed by her in an effort to disrupt that system. Rather than being radically liberatory, freed women like her tapped into the power of others and the system of slavery to gain material privileges and to sustain their survival. Freedom then existed and experienced by people of African descent. In this context, reproduced the brutal systems of Black dispossession and confinement. In contrast to the complicated life and relative privilege of Pringle Polgreen, I want to shift attention to the category of captive African, whose archival intangibilities evade our efforts to define slavery and freedom, but also commodity and human. Here we must go back a century before Polgreen's notorious rise to economic prominence and mytho-visibility, but to the same site of commerce. On May 21st, 1676, the slave ship James anchored in Carlisle Bay, the main port of Bridgetown, Barbados, after a voyage of over 10 weeks across the Atlantic from the Gold Coast. When the first day of the slave sale commenced on Thursday, May 25th, the agents of the Royal Africa Company in Bridgetown, Mr. Steed and Mr. Gascoigne, sold 163 of the African captives on board. By Saturday, May 27th, they sold 118 more. Trying to empty his ship of captives and complete his obligations to the stakeholders of the voyage, the captain of the James, Peter Blake, wrote, quote, "Tuesday the 30th. This day I went on board with a planter to sell him some of the refuse slaves, but he did not like them. But the next day he, quote, sold 5 of the refuse slaves." A disembarkation of African captives in Bridgetown, which began with 372 survivors of the Middle Passage, ended in Bridgetown with one notation. On Tuesday, June 6, Captain Blake recorded that while his crew agreed to sail onto the island of Nevis with 223 additional captives from another ship that arrived from the Bight of Biafra, quote, Mr. Gascoigne fetched ashore the remaining slaves from the James, being 7 men and 10 women, end quote. European planters and traders complained that the captives from Biafra were weak and sickly. They thus quickly became victims of transshipment to more, quote, desperate slave markets like St. Kitts and Nevis, and labeled as refuse Bight slaves by skeptical purchasers. On a final entry of the, quote, quick sale in Nevis, about 1 week after the James's arrival there, hints at the destruction of lives on board. On Thursday, June 22nd, 1676, after at least 9 months' captivity on board a slave ship, Captain Blake writes of the last Africans to disembark as casually as the weather, quote, "This morning we sold all the slaves, 19 being very bad were carried ashore. 18 of them were sold for 1,000 pounds of sugar per head, and one, which was a mad wench, was sold for 1,400 pounds of sugar. Also in the morning, aboard 20 refuse slaves were sold at 1,700 pounds of sugar per head. These 24 hours I have had the wind at east and by south and at east-northeast," end quote. 9 more captives, 8 women and 1 man, died during the week it took to complete the Nevis sale. Though we catch a glimpse of a captive woman whose condition of, quote, madness marks a troubling individuality among otherwise anonymous cargo, the 20 refuse slaves disappear in the price of sugar paid for their expiring lives. The captives deemed refuse leave the ship nameless and enumerated. 7 men and 10 women. 2 of them dead, and 2 more will not live. 11 and 7 that died before sold any, and several since. These numbered bodies make up the discarded lives of the slave trade. Their ultimate fate remains invisible in the archive, precisely due to their declining condition and their devaluation to the captain, traders, and merchants seeking to maximize profit in the sale of these human lives. The idea of the human was being consolidated as capitalism took hold of the Atlantic world. Notions of human liberty and property rights emerged alongside the rationality of Black death and disposability. At stake here is an initial attempt to locate the people lost in the system of human commodification in order to understand how the negation of their human status was initiated in the first iterations of slave production and early modern capitalism, and how escape from the condition of enslavement and captivity did not engender a life outside of this matrix, but rather human liminality and often violent death. The captives carried off to James were part of a complex of capital investment that relied on their ability to labor. If we think about the transatlantic slave trade as a mode of slave production, a market that produced bodies for labor, then we must also acknowledge the humans that were turned into waste from this same mode of production. Abolitionist and naval officer James Ramsay sent an essay to the Privy Council of the British Parliament in the late 1780s, providing evidence of African captives' deaths in port who were unsellable. He explains, quote, "The proportion of refuse slaves depends upon the size of the ship, the length of the passage, and the breaking out of any epidemic disorder among them. In general, a very considerable number set aside as refuse might be seen at the sales, nor can I recollect one single sale where they made not a part, perhaps a fifth of the whole number, may be a moderate estimate for the whole trade. Perhaps 1 in 3 may recover, but in others, almost all die before they become useful. At the sales, they appear naked, emaciated, some unable to stand, and some are too ill to be brought on shore," end quote. This concept of usefulness exemplifies one of the many violent and ethical problems with this early capitalist economy, one that did not ensure freedom in free market exchange, but rather produced and depended upon slavery and proximity to death. The term refuse connotes both waste and refusal. The women, infants, children, and men were refused by traders as not profitable based on their emaciation, illness, debility, and mental state. They were accused of melancholia, madness, dejection, and disease. Some died before they boarded ships on the West African coasts, and others languished in the ports of the Atlantic world. They existed in human limbo, neither slaves nor human, and within different conceptions of death, social, civic, civil, figurative, and literal. Their value extinguished, they bore the stigma of the decommodified. For historian Stephanie Smallwood, the process by which humans became chattel started at the literal and continued through the Middle Passage. This method included being shackled in fetters, deprived of control over food intake, and the calculations made on how much sustenance, space, and air was necessary to prevent captives' deaths. Pausing here for a moment, I want to consider that the process of commodification presumes at some point that the captive was free. But even here, the concept of freedom falls short, as many captives may have been prisoners of war prior to their purchase by Europeans. Nevertheless, speaking of the economic machinations of the slave trading literal, Smallwood argues, quote, "The violence exercised in the service of human commodification relied on a scientific empiricism, always seeking to find the limits of human capacity for suffering, that point where material and social poverty threatened to consume entirely the lives it was meant to garner for sale in the Americas," end quote. Here Smallwood poignantly articulates the necropolitics of the slave trade. Smallwood continues, quote, "The economic enterprise of human trafficking marked a watershed in what would become an enduring project in the modern Western world, probing the limits up to which it is possible to discipline the body without extinguishing the life within. Theoretically, then, the process of decommodification, of deciding a body has passed the limits of possibility, which drew from similar if opposite calculi and technologies, might work to rehumanize the captives from unsellable commodity back to human. Yet the layered processes of the slave trade that rendered humans into capital, commodity, and on the other side, waste, did not relieve or restore people caught in this system of flesh traffic. On the contrary, in this instance, the opposite of commodification is not freedom or humanity, but rather death and disposal. The horrors of freedom materialize in bodily degradation and a particular kind of suffering. The African captives characterized as refuse evade historical articulation because their lives are fleeting, fragmented, and they are mentioned only in the loss they create. They reside in the column of debits on a slave ship's ledger. They cannot fit our historiographical examples for resistance or help us to understand how people made lives and built communities under the violent conditions of slavery. The category of refuse represents the impossibilities of life under such conditions, and the dying captives themselves refuse our desire for empirical material with which to narrate such experiences. I'm interested in the systematic authority and necessary structures of violence and power that European colonists deployed to make African captives live, to be commodified, or make them die. What do we make of this figure that has eluded the historiography? Why follow the dead and the dying? Accounting for these lives lost also provides us several pathways to ponder the status of value, category, or genre of human in the early modern Atlantic world. Scholars in critical Black studies, and I include Winter, Spillers, Wahalia, and others, provide a theoretical language for deconstructing the universality of man from the human and open spaces, as Wahalia argues, for new objects of knowledge and tools to resist the naturalization of systems of racial, gendered, and economic subjugation. But I would argue the archives of and historical work on the slave trade and the category of the refuse slave explicate a particular language of human liminality enmeshed within systems of economic violence that grounds figurative formulations of Black studies scholars in the early modern era into the space where concepts of race and susceptibility to death originally cohered for the project of white supremacy and economic domination. Dwelling on the deaths of African captives upon arrival in the Americas also expands the work of scholars interested in the relationship between capitalism and slavery. Yet it confounds that scholarship's reliance on laboring and able bodies. This is an argument that not only were the systems of slavery and the slave trade complex capitalist in nature, but production did not always yield productivity. If we start in the early modern Atlantic, our discussions of human conditions, racial hierarchies, and power, freedom, and democracy reveal the continuum of human precarity from European conquests of peoples and lands in the Americas to our present. As Hartman concludes, quote, "Our dispossession is ongoing. The hold of the slave trip continues to shape how we live," end quote. From the refused slaves to the life of a freed woman in a Caribbean slave society, Western ideals of freedom and democracy have always been tethered to Black precarity and vulnerability. We must find a new language to imagine otherwise. Thank you.
I'm just going to sit here. Is that okay? I think that's okay, right? Okay. So, oh, okay. I've not done this kind of paper in a very long time. I haven't written something, so I'm making up the words between little notes on my paper. And let me describe what I want to sort of think out loud about, and hopefully in a way that encourages conversation. I've been working on the idea of impasse, of people in different historical moments or in different theoretical traditions experiencing stuckness, where they feel and experience a sense that there's no motion and that there's no future, that they can't go forward, that there's forms of repetition or paralysis. I see this moment recurring a lot in political theory, and I've been especially interested in thinking about the idea of impasse around, especially in regards to Afro-pessimism, and thinking about the racial impasse in the United States. For me, thinking about that, I found the work of Fred Moten incredibly generative, because he has, I think, in ways that Yasmin suggested, I think, in her account of Harriet Jacobs, that there is, through an idea of fugitivity, a way to take the immobility out of impasse. That is, a way to imagine a kind of vitality and life in and both despite and in and through a stuck place. And that I find that an incredibly generative idea, especially in regard to my older, earlier ideas of what would count as radical change, in which change involves a decisive movement out of a condition of domination into a condition of freedom. And I mean, many of you know Neil, writing about comparative freedom, is questioning that narrative. Many of us are in a variety of ways. So the idea of fugitivity seems to be at the center of thinking this way. And so what I want to do today is just take the word. Because it seems to me the word is traveling a lot right now and doing a lot of work. And it's across the humanities. And there are a whole set of sort of reactions and questions that I want to ask, I think, and as a way of trying to think about what fugitivity means in regards to freedom, politics, and democracy. My horizon on this is thinking about the different ways that the language of fugitivity or the fugitive figures in the work of Wolin and of Moten, but then also in the background for me is Arendt writing about stateless and refugees, who she doesn't always use the language of fugitivity about them, but I take that to be the absolutely formative experience. I think the Greek stuff is actually itself her way of trying to deal with this other problem. So I want to think about the idea of fugitive, and I want to think about it in relation to other words, concepts. Agonism, lines of flight, linked in Deleuze with deterritorialization, marinage, and actually from a previous encounter with Angelica, the Zapatistas, and thinking about different conceptualizations of flight, resistance, and struggle. Okay, so I've already forgotten when I started. Okay. So fugitive, what kind of, I mean, grammatically, Nick's going to have to help me with this, but it's a noun. It is a kind of subject. It is naming a condition. It is a condition of being illegal, of being interdicted. A slave is not a fugitive until they run away, maybe. It's also an adjective or an adverb, I'm not sure. It's a modifier. It invokes escaping, fleeing, evading. It is then related to being hunted or wanted. And then you would go evading, fleeing, or escaping what? And clearly, the first thing we would say is slavery, which would be to say escaping being owned, which would be to say escaping being property, which means that you're stealing property by escaping. But it's also more about evading the law, norms, control, prohibition, rule. When Audre Lorde says we were not meant to survive, that means that fugitives are escaping death, proximity to death, vulnerability to death. There's something about further associations, just as I'm playing this out. There is a paranoid quality to any fugitive, but the paranoid quality is a Pynchonesque one. They are following you, but it does bespeak a sense of the world as organized by control and surveillance, and you're a target, being targeted, therefore being out of place, not at home, no place, no home, nowhere is home, nowhere is safe, never at rest, always on the run. I mean, some of the older folks here might remember The Fugitive from TV that was then redone by, what's his name? Indiana Jones, yes, Harrison Ford. But the sense of never being at rest and always running and escaping, and therefore connected with the liminal, with the interstitial. There's something about not being in Egypt, but not being in the promised land either, in a wilderness condition, as the Protestants used to call it, that no longer enslaved, but not yet free. I don't know if Douglas's distinction between being a slave in fact as opposed to a slave in form would be pertinent here, but it might be. And that, so also then linked to the clandestine, the covert, to live by concealment, but also to live without status. I think a lot of sans-papiers, to live, in Moten's language, to live without credit, in many senses. Okay. Then the next cluster, so the kinds of experiences, it's almost like a phenomenology of the modifiers that the fugitive does when we use it as an adjective or an adverb, but then also something about what a fugitive's desire. And I'm going to, despite Yasmin's wonderful reminder about resisting either or, I keep falling into them, so you guys will correct me on this, but what do fugitives desire? Well, one would say freedom from capture, slavery, law, punishment, regulation. There's some desire to get outside a system of control, or to find an outside is how Moten often puts it, and yet can you find the outside inside? And that seems to me actually what much thinking about fugitivity is trying to articulate is an outside that's inside, an alternative that's inside, a kind of heterotopic space. but the freedom from, and then also freedom to, something like another kind of community or another kind of life. Where, question mark, with whom, question mark, how, question mark, not clear. But it does seem to me that there's something, a tension I would want to say, and maybe it should be a both and not an either or, between the language of wanting a fugitive condition to end and to own how much we wish it to end, and that to not recognize how awful it is to be a fugitive seems to me a risk we run if we treat it too metaphorically. That it is a desperate condition, literally understood. And then you want it to end. I mean, it's like King's, speech, free at last, free at last. I mean, on the other hand, what I see all across the humanities is the effort, in effect, to make the fugitive condition permanent by imagining it as a sensibility. That is, accept that we can't have a revolution. If you accept the condition of possibility, that is not possible. So then you end up with this different sense of fugitivity as an ongoing kind of life that is lived in relationship to all institutions. And it's not exactly about getting rid of them or overcoming them in any overt way, but it may be about undoing them, and the relationship between what is practiced covertly as opposed to what might be conducted flagrantly in public seems to me an important kind of tension. It often seems to me when I read Moten, he really wants to make fugitivity the ground of community itself, which is a big move, actually. Okay, so that's two clusters of things. Here's the third. I think my question to Nick comes from, I did some version of my paper on Moten at University of Minnesota, and it was a disastrous experience because everybody in the audience assumed that fugitivity was a masculine idea, and only for men, and that only men can escape, and that what fugitivity is about is not escaping slavery, but escaping attachment. And that fugitivity is inherent. Okay, so, I, of course, said that's way too narrow, but I've been thinking a lot about why that reaction. And so here's my next cluster of thoughts. When you go back in the American tradition, there are really two traditions of thinking about fugitivity. One tradition is Huck Finn, fleeing Aunt Polly and lighting off to the territory. The whole frontier, manifest destiny, frontier narrative is a narrative of fugitivity that ultimately involves ideas of marriage or refounding, but it's about flight. And in American letters, beginning with Emerson, and we got this in your paper about nature in a way. Emerson's nature begins with, we build the sepulchres of the fathers. We're imprisoned. We're imprisoned in culture. We're entombed. We're dead. We're only alive in some having a pulse. And then Emerson says, can we not also have an original relationship to nature? So the idea of escaping entombment and of society as entombing and imprisoning is in some sense a foundational idea. I don't want to say a foundational American idea. I want to say an idea that sort of imagines America before there is one. This sense of escaping imprisonment, and that was typically a white male idea. And you get it in transcendentalism. You get it in Thoreau's Walking, and so on. Kerouac, On the Road, all that stuff. Mailer's White Negro. All these men over hundreds of years imagining and identifying with a certain kind of fugitivity. Melville's Moby Dick begins with, "Call me Ishmael." What's he doing when he does that? So that there's one tradition of thinking about fugitivity in the culture that really is gendered, and that is and often involves a kind of problematic racial cross-dressing, whereby some kind of imagination of identification with natives or fugitives or ex-slaves is, or psychopathic black people in Harlem for Mailer are ways of imagining actually escaping a kind of conformity in white culture. And then there's, so I imagine that may be where the people from Minnesota were coming from, in simply not, and whereas Moten describes fugitivity as congregational, to use Yasmin's language, but he uses the language of maternal very directly. So for Moten, sociality, maternity, and fugitivity are inescapably, inseparably connected to each other and generative of the kind of freedom that people can have when they're still in the hold of slavery and its afterlife. And in the tradition of black political thought, that's a recurring set of connections, I think. I mean, going back to, as Nick described, or at least described to me, Douglas's rewriting of the first biography by the second begins with the women and the mothers and the grandmothers. But when Ellison writes The Invisible Man, the last figure in the book is Reinhardt, who spelled differently than Mark's name. I didn't know that at first. I actually, when I first met Mark, I spelled it like Reinhardt because of Ellison. But anyway, Reinhardt is a trickster and a masker and always on the run because he's escaping control and confinement through the constant play with masks. And Ellison's very attracted, I think, to this figure, but also feels like he's predatory. So the voice is not just that. The question about what that identification with fugitivity means inside Ellison's novel, I think it's pretty complicated. But I also think in the what do you want to call it, the white tradition, Thelma and Louise, Adrienne Rich, Andrea Dworkin. But there's very rich kind of language across really all of American history around fugitivity. Third cluster. That was the third, probably. Okay. So, but it's somehow related to the question of the gendering of the idea. So I see a set of questions, and then I'll say something about Moten and Wolin. The relationship between the literal and the figurative is one question. The second is the relationship between the solitary and the collective. Truancy is often described as an individual thing. The question of whether it involves exit from a condition, or Moten's language is escaping it but not leaving it. Third is the question about what fugitives really desire. Now, maybe that I shouldn't say it really, as if there were one true desire of the fugitive. The fourth is the ways in which fugitivity is imposed and must be, as opposed to the way it can be adopted as a pose, or more generously, be adopted as a practice, as a way of living relations. Fifth is, what's the relationship between escape and world building? Because it seems to me the impulse is to say there's escape and then there's world building. World building implicates you in institutions. Escape is about leaving. We need to break down that opposition, but it's not there just by random. There's a question about what an investment in constantly being fugitive means in terms of the responsibility of building ongoing institutions. If people define themselves primarily as fugitives, what is the entailment of that in terms of actually taking responsibility in an ongoing way for institutions that always have profound regulative elements? So somebody like Thoreau says, I'm not the son of an engineer, I'm not responsible for the running the machinery of society, and I am deeply sympathetic to that. But there is something that I feel when I read Moten where I want a little more responsibility. Okay, and last thought, and then I guess I should just stop with that, is the genre question. What kind of genre is thinking about things through the terms of fugitivity? For me, thinking especially about political thought. What would it mean to think about political thought as a fugitive thing as compared to thinking, I think of Wolin talking about the describing political theory in the genre of the epic, or of epic theory. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you all for those wonderful contributions. I am tempted to follow Gretchen's example and have you start by responding to each other, but I also know there must be a lot of folks in the audience eager to get in on the conversation. So why don't we just start by fielding some questions from the audience, but with the invitation and the encouragement as you're responding to folks to also respond to each other and observe any connections that you might have seen between your three papers. So who would like to go first?
Thank you. Fabulous panel. I see so many intersections here among your talks. And I'm just going to seize on the most obvious one, I think, for me anyway. It's the question of language. Maurice, kind of close to the end of your talk, you said we must find a new language to imagine otherwise, right? And Helika's talk was offering, you might say, a kind of radically new language. I certainly was not familiar with it. And then George was bringing up, okay, we've got this word fugitive, and in one sense it's a word that comes burdened with this other very gendered traditional American narrative of escape. So I'm kind of, and I know, well, Diva and I were talking, about this, the same thing with social movements today. To what extent, in order to be understood, do they need to draw upon a familiar lexicon and kind of try to transform it? So that's really kind of my question for everybody is, where do you kind of come out on that question of whether the old language is no longer usable and we need a truly new language, in which case, how do we make that language understood in order for it to have political uptake? Conversely, if we have to draw on the old language in order to be understood, but transform it, what are the protocols for doing that such that we can have some assurance that we are bringing more new to the table than we are replicating the old, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a question for the whole panel.
Guess I'll start. Thanks, Nick, for this question, because I've been thinking a lot about it, because there's been a lot of real cost in terms of introducing this language for indigenous social movements. So one of the most egregious ones is just violence. So the language is introduced, and as a sort of backlash of introducing this language is state immediately introduced dismissive discourses about what they call papachamaísmo, to diminish and call indigenous people primitives, backwards, and to tap into racial attitudes about how they were standing in the way of this. So there's some real concerns about translation that I'm still very much tackling with, because just when you see some movements coming together with some of these ideas, you see a lot of backlash of racism in that attempt to translate and to engage. And that's a serious problem. And it's become, I mean, and it continues right now. It's even more intensified, and the result of that then is, death, violence, death threats, et cetera. So I don't have a clear answer for that. I think it's a really important question about translation. And it's one that's incredibly urgent, so that you can deal with some of these issues of racism and violence.
I want to answer and offer an answer, but I also want to ask you, so in a kind of offering of the language, it opens another kind of vulnerability to be then the subject of new kinds of violences. Not new in the sense that they weren't subject to violence and racialization in the first place, but new forms of it coming through, this very powerful reconfiguring of what it means to be human, right? It's just, so maybe that's not a question, but it's just really powerful. I was really struck by the work that you're doing and that the activists are doing. So what I would say this, and I'm going to fall on, even though I resist disciplines and all, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, but here I feel like a real historian. And I would say this, it was simply that I struggled with the Caribbean archive, the early modern Caribbean archive, to find a way to describe what I was finding that wasn't situated in antebellum US formulations of freedom, agency, resistance, because it doesn't map on to there. And then if we think historically, we know also that everything started in the Caribbean and moved upward. So what is it about, like, origins of unfreedom, origins of black disposability that we might need to understand to come up with a new language that, again, is sort of outside of the frame of a very specific, late antebellum US configuration. So that was my impetus for thinking about language. And then, again, I think part of the issue for historians is that, this lack of archive. But refuse, slave, actually forces us to kind of account for, I want to say a couple things too about Afro-pessimism, but it allows us to account for those that have not been accounted for. And in the most, sort of the best efforts of history is to kind of resist the quantification of the slave trade work, that the databases and all of that kind of reproduce a accounting language to kind of acknowledge, but they still fall, these people fall out, and they're all over the archive. And I think I'm trying to figure out how to talk about them, to articulate in a new language the spectrum of unfreedom that can manifest in slavery, in slave societies in this era, right? It's rather than to foreclose possibilities of fugitivity or resistance or pushing back, rather than to foreclose that, but just to kind of add this into our knowledge base of understanding what exactly slavery was, right? So I resist Afro-pessimism because it's not historical and grounded in any kind of archive. And that's probably an empiricist thing for me to say. But I think that if it was, then they would have to do some more work in finding language and philosophical configurations.
I guess what I thought about the language question was I had two associations. One is with Audre Lorde, who, I mean, I take her as saying there's no new ideas. And it's all about recovery and remaking of inherited ideas, so that those aren't brand new ideas. They're ancient ideas, I think, but re-modified or themselves translated. So I don't see that there would be, and I think the other association I have is, again, with reading Moten, he's all about the language of preservation and the sense of we already have languages, ways of talking about our experience that we need to protect. And so there's not, it doesn't seem like there's necessarily an engagement of persuasion to the people who do logistics. No, it's a language among the shipped. So I'm not sure that's even an issue necessarily. I think it depends.
I have a question, and it's also kind of for the whole panel. And for me, when I was listening to the panel, I thought that each of you were giving us clues about how to reconfigure the concept of the human, or something like that, if there has to be a new word. As just a side note, if there's no new things in Afro-pessimist thought, maybe that's why they're feeling so, gotta have new things. But anyway, so I guess I want to ask everybody to sort of expand on what these reconfigurations might mean, right? So the reconfiguration of the human as deeply embedded in the living environment, and that being about well-being, that being about not only well-being as in feeling good and being healthy, but actually in being the fullness of your being, or something like that. And sort of, I don't know, I want you to sort of talk more about how that maybe is or might move into mainstream discourses in Ecuador, and maybe it's kind of reshaping the way people think. And then I found your paper really super fascinating, Marisa, and what I kept thinking about when you were telling the story of the refuse slaves, right? The refuse enslaved is the story of the Igbo who who would throw themselves off the ship. Yeah. And that juxtaposition just kept like sort of repeating in my head, and I just wonder if I could ask you to riff on it and sort of tell me what it means. Yeah. That it keeps kind of occurring to me. Yeah. Maybe like two different views of agency, or ways that we can view desert or existence or being. I don't know, but there's something there. Yeah. And then George, with your paper, I felt like I was really stimulated by this important recognition, I think, of fugitivity as being this desperate state. But I don't know if, and maybe Neil can, but I don't know if flight and fugitivity are identical, right? Like flight can mean escape, right? But it can also mean to fly, like a bird, right? And so then what does it mean to have practices of freedom that allow you to be in flight, right, as a way of life? So maybe it's not like sort of endless running and escape from, but perhaps you can build a world where you can fly right? So this question of flight and world building, so I don't know.
So again. So I think that your question relates a lot to Nick, and as I'm letting and digesting this really challenging question, that I'm feeling like, okay, there are some possibilities for starting to figure out translation and reconfiguration and what it means to radically transform certain understandings, like the human. And I think, so just to, for me, I also have to historicize it, but also archives and empirical work helps a lot. And so empirically, when I was doing research in my first book, and all the stuff in the Constituent Assembly, I was doing interviews and all that, I saw that one of the things that happened was that this concept and some of these indigenous concepts came in not initially as a co-optation from the state at all, but in fact, they were indigenous representatives who were talking with other people who were allies, long allies, and so there was that process of translation going on that matched into a lot of work that was happening with post-developmentalism and attempts to sort of engage and sort of rethink about what it would mean to go to develop an alternative economy beyond development. And so that sort of matched up, and the concept provided a helpful vehicle for transmitting that. So it kind of ended up looking like a Frankenstein thing, because then a lot of other, as all constitutions, it ends up being a lot of people involved in the making of it, and some of the other elements of it sort of were more about the state, and the president eventually had a big hand in it and sort of made a lot of corrections. So it ended up that some of those translations were mistranslations. But that advocacy work and those relationships continued and continue to this day. So between these different allies and these different indigenous and non-indigenous thinkers working along the same lines to kind of reconfigure and figure out matching language. Some of that has been environmentalism language and tapping into movements above the state, transnational movements like Keep It in the Ground and figuring out language like that. The other way in which the language is moving is social media. So the hashtags, social media, a lot of that helps a lot. So there's a recent attacks on Guarani territory and the Amazon, and immediately it's all over social media. So there's that push continually to transmit the language beyond the states in ways that becomes at times difficult for the state to control. So it's something, not to say that the violence is not, it's something against that there are pockets of that translation work. And so what it means is that that articulation's happening. One of the ways that it was proposed is as an alternative environmental category to be used. So in international covenants coming up in these international forums like the COP21 in Paris and in other forums, these climate change forums, is to push to have these categories like zone free from mining be part of international covenants or international treaties. And so put that language and codify in some way. That push is also not new. That push has been happening with indigenous internationalism since the 60s and 70s, and sort of part of my own work is now trying to trace all that out and properly historicize that it's not new, that it's been happening, and where it's been more receptive. Where you see a lot of the reception has been in international forums. Now it also comes at a price. But those flows are attempts to reconfigure, and a lot of it has been to change how people do politics in various spaces and how they, for instance, write a treaty or engage in developing policies at the national level in terms of health centers and health clinics, schools, educational programs. So the idea would be if something seeps like this, and in some ways it has, is to reconfigure all that and becomes now a new governing ethical, moral orientation towards policies, as best you can say, but also local governance. So a lot of it has also been the push towards more local governance and sort of seeing this seep more at the local level. So that's where it's had a lot more traction. Like recently, a lot of new indigenous delegates that were in this very clear anti-extractivist position got elected, and that was shocking. And recently, they just decided a case that stopped the mining. For the first time, a case on these rights of natures was won, and they're kicking out a Chinese company from Cuenca. So some traction. Some of this language is seeping in.
I just want to be aware of time. What is
Oh.
it, 12:30?
Yes,
Okay, so I'll answer this very quickly. I'll answer this very quickly. Or I'll think through it with you very quickly. One thing is, I guess I want to be clear with this project and my last project that, again, I'm not foreclosing the possibility of resistance, of pushing back to dehumanization. And one thing with the Ibos and the story, right? So there's this overlap between European perceptions of Biafrans being these people prone to suicide and weak and sickly. And then there's the reality that, or right, the evidence that people actually refused food on the ships and collectively killed themselves, right? So there's that, and I'm fully acknowledging that. And I also think that there's a great book by Terry Snyder that is literally a book about slave suicide on the ships. And as, you know, rethinking resistance and rethinking death as a form of resistance and rethinking death as a form of freedom, right? So there's that work being done. So all I think I'm doing is paying attention to the trends in the scholarship and match and reading the archive against the trends to just shift the light to another phenomenon, and that is that it's the larger paper that this is from, that the word refuse there's a word for refuse slave in every language of the colonial Caribbean: French, Dutch, Spanish. What am I forgetting? French, Dutch, Spanish, English, Portuguese. The Portuguese is the only word I haven't discovered. So that to me seems that there's a trans-colonial, universal concept of black disposability. So race is being configured and disposability, and they're being put together at this moment, and everybody from Europe is recognizing or helping that be perpetuated. I'm interested in elaborating what that means in that moment, and then hopefully people will kind of see this very specific historical moment resonate. Oh, this is the origin of black disposability. I want to say one more thing too. There's a way that this condition has fallen out of philosophical considerations. And the closest to this person, this is the Muslim, described by Agamben and Primo Levi, of someone who's falling into a state of non-being. And yet, this is happening in the 17th century, in the 15th century. And so it puts that 20th century history into a trajectory of, rather than an exceptional point, right? I acknowledge all of these ways in which captives would put themselves in a refuse category at the same time as I think many more succumbed to the starvation, the brutality, and all the figurations of refuge, which included infants that were killed at the site of sale, or elderly people, or people that were deemed disabled in some way. So I sort of just shift the gaze that way in that.
I think that's a wonderful question. I guess I see, thinking again mostly about Moten these days, fullness of being is plenitude, a kind of vitalism is the, I guess, how do I want to respond to this? It is to go from being in flight to flying. If you're just in flight, they've beaten you. So there's something in, I think it's across all of black literature, but it's something about flying is a condition of freedom that at some level not masters, but is not defeated by the intensity or urgency or, yes, it folds it in. So that's what I take him to be making fugitivity into, so that it would be something to affirm, actually. So I read him as, I read him as Nietzschean in the sense that there's amor fati. And to love one's fate is to make that a condition of possibility, not a, and so that's, to me, how he is sort of modeling a relationship to impasse that's not defeated or defined by it in the end. I don't know if that was...
Lacking the time to do justice to more of your questions, I think I would suggest just bring them with you to lunch and continue the conversation there, if that sounds right to you, Neil.
Yeah.
Is that